I always liked hiking alone. It was peaceful, quiet, and gave me time to clear my mind. I never went too deep into the woods, just far enough that I could be alone with my thoughts. This time, I chose a trail I hadn't done before. It was in a national forest not too far from where I lived. I had checked the maps, packed enough food and water, and even brought a small emergency kit. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp air with the sun just warm enough to be comfortable. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, and the forest was beautiful. Tall trees stretched high, their branches forming a canopy that let speckled sunlight hit the ground. Birds chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. Squirrels, maybe a deer, nothing unusual. After about 5 miles, I reached a split in the trail. According to the map, one path led to a scenic overlook, while the other continued deeper into the woods. I decided to take the longer path into the forest. It was less traveled, meaning it would be quieter, and I wanted the extra challenge. As I walked, the sounds of the forest started to change. The birds were quieter. The wind in the trees sounded different, almost distant. I brushed it off as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept going. The trail narrowed and the trees grew denser. I checked my phone, no signal. That wasn't surprising. I had expected it, but it still made me uneasy. After another mile, I noticed something strange. The trail looked wrong. The dirt was disturbed in an unnatural way, like something heavy had been dragged across it. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. No sounds, no movement. Just me and the trees. I walked a little farther, my eyes scanning the ground. Then I saw it, a boot print. Not mine. It was fresh, deep in the mud, and facing the direction I had just come from. Someone else was out here. I wasn't sure why that made me uneasy. Plenty of people hike these trails, but something about it bothered me. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day.
No distant voices, no snapping twigs.
Whoever made this print was close. I kept walking a little faster now. The trail curved sharply, and as I rounded the bend, I stopped. There was something ahead, a backpack. It was sitting just off the trail, half unzipped. It looked new, not like it had been left there for long. I called out. No answer. I walked closer and hesitated before kneeling down to look inside. A water bottle, some granola bars, a map. No ID, no phone. Nothing personal. The uneasy feeling in my stomach got worse. Someone had left this here recently. But why? I stood up and looked around again. The forest was too quiet. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. Then, in the distance, a sound. A low, steady thumping, like footsteps. I turned in the direction of the noise, my body tense. It was coming from deeper in the woods, off the trail. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay calm. If someone was in trouble, I couldn't just walk away. I stepped off the trail, moving slowly, carefully. The underbrush was thick, making it hard to move quietly. The sound continued, steady, deliberate. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, small but open. In the middle of it, something large was hanging from a tree. A deer. It was gutted, its insides spilling onto the forest floor. The cuts were clean, precise. This wasn't an animal attack. Someone had done this. I felt a cold chill run through me. This wasn't right. I had to go. Now, I turned back toward the trail, moving quickly. My breathing was loud, too loud. I needed to stay quiet. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I froze, my body rigid. The steps were slow, controlled, deliberate. Whoever was there wanted me to hear them. I forced myself to move. Faster now. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I needed to get back to the trail, back to safety. A branch snapped behind me. I ran. My feet pounded the ground, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees blurred past me. I didn't look back. I reached the trail and didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Then, up ahead, something moved. A figure, standing in the middle of the trail. I skidded to a stop, my heart hammering. They were dressed in dark clothing, a hood pulled up over their head. I couldn't see their face. I took a step back. They didn't move. Then, slowly, they lifted one arm and pointed at me. I turned and ran the other way. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out of here. I needed to. A hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed and yanked away, stumbling back. My foot caught on a root and I hit the ground hard. Pain shot up my leg, but I scrambled to my feet. The figure was gone. I didn't wait. I ran, ignoring the pain, ignoring everything except the desperate need to get out of those woods. I don't remember the rest of the run back. My mind was in a blur, my body running on pure adrenaline. When I finally saw my car in the distance, I nearly collapsed in relief. I didn't look back. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out of there. I never went hiking alone again. A week later, I saw a news report. A body had been found near that trail. A missing hiker. No signs of an animal attack.
No explanation.
Just gone. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't want to know. But I know one thing. I was being hunted. I never really liked hiking alone, but I had done it enough times that I figured I could handle myself. The woods always made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain, even when I knew there was nothing out there but trees, dirt, and maybe a few deer. I was used to hearing little noises and brushing them off as harmless. But this time was different. I had taken a few days off work and decided to spend a long weekend in the mountains. I planned out a solo hike, nothing extreme, just a moderate trail that looped about 15 miles through the forest, starting and ending at the same spot. I'd camp overnight, take my time, and get back before dark the next day. I had all my gear, plenty of food and water, and a charged phone with an extra battery pack. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, clear skies, and no storms in the forecast. It should have been an easy trip. I parked my truck at the small gravel lot near the trailhead and set off around noon. The first few miles were exactly what I expected. Peaceful, quiet, just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and leaves. I passed a couple of hikers going the opposite way, nodded a hello, and kept moving. As I got deeper into the woods, the trail became narrower, the trees more crowded together. It was the kind of place where the sunlight barely made it through, and even in the middle of the day, everything felt dim. I hiked for hours, stopping now and then to drink water and adjust my pack. Around 5 in the evening, I started looking for a good place to set up camp. I found a small clearing a little ways off the main trail, flat and open enough for my tent, but still surrounded by enough trees to feel hidden. I set everything up quickly, ate a protein bar and some jerky for dinner, and sat for a while, just listening to the sounds of the forest. Everything seemed normal, wind rustling the leaves, the occasional crack of a branch as some small animal moved through the underbrush. Then, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I heard something else. It was faint at first, so soft I almost missed it. A distant thud, then another, like something heavy moving through the woods, but too slow and deliberate to be an animal. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a branch falling somewhere out of sight, but that feeling of unease settled deep in my chest. I forced myself to relax. I climbed into my tent, zipped myself in, and lay there in my sleeping bag, staring up at the thin fabric above me. I could still hear normal forest sounds. Wind, leaves, distant birds. Nothing unusual. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. It was pitch black inside the tent. My first thought was that something had woken me up, but I couldn't remember hearing anything. I held my breath, listening. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, a sound quiet but close. A soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I reached slowly for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing outside the mesh of my tent. The footsteps had stopped. I sat up, trying to calm myself down. It was probably just a deer, I told myself. Maybe even a raccoon. But my gut told me something wasn't right. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have dozed off. The next time I woke up, it was early morning, the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees. Everything was quiet. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, stretching my stiff muscles. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine, and not from an animal. They were human, large, and deep in the dirt, circling my tent. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. Someone had walked around my tent, stopping just feet from where I had been lying. I scanned the trees, my breath coming fast. The forest was still and empty, but that didn't mean anything. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Whoever had been out here could still be close. I hurried to pack up my gear, moving as quickly as I could without making too much noise. I didn't bother eating breakfast, I just needed to get out of there. I got back on the trail, walking fast but not running. I didn't want to look like prey. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. That wasn't unusual this deep in the woods, but it made me feel even more alone. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was never anyone there. The hike back felt twice as long as it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. I told myself it was probably just another hiker who had passed my campsite in the night. Maybe they hadn't meant anything by it. But the footprints had been too deliberate, too close. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the clearing where I had parked. Relief flooded through me. I practically jogged the last stretch, yanking open my truck door and tossing my pack inside. I locked the doors as soon as I was in and sat there for a moment, breathing hard. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the tree line. Just for a second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing far back in the shadows. Too far to make out any details, but there, watching. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps? That I found footprints? That I had a bad feeling? It wouldn't have mattered. But I haven't been back to that trail since. And I don't think I ever will. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me time to think, to breathe, to just exist without the noise of the world around me. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, some longer than others, but nothing had ever gone wrong until this one. It was early October, the time of year when the trees were starting to turn but still held on to most of their leaves. The air was cool, crisp, perfect for a long hike. I had planned a 3-day solo trip through a remote section of a national forest, somewhere with no cell service, no crowds, just miles and miles of wilderness. I packed everything I needed: extra food, water filtration, emergency gear, a satellite messenger in case things went really bad. I wasn't reckless, just someone who liked to be alone in nature. The first day was perfect. I hiked through towering trees, their golden leaves crunching under my boots. I followed a narrow, winding trail that led me deep into the forest, past creeks and over ridges where I could see nothing but untouched land stretching for miles. It felt good to be out there, breathing in the cool air, away from everything. By late afternoon, I found a good place to set up camp. Flat ground close to a small stream, far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be bothered if by some slim chance another hiker came through. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the fire as the sun went down. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of an animal. I slept well that night, nothing but the quiet of the forest around me. The second day was where things started to feel off. I woke early, packed up, and continued deeper into the forest. The trail became rougher, less maintained, the kind that didn't see much foot traffic. The deeper I went, the more overgrown it got. By mid-afternoon, it was barely a trail at all, just a faint path cutting through dense trees. I wasn't worried. I had my GPS and a map, and I knew where I was. But something about the place felt different. The silence was heavier. It's hard to explain, but the deeper I went, the more I noticed it. The forest wasn't completely silent. There was still wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a twig, but it felt like something was missing. There were no birds, no insects buzzing, none of the little background noises that usually filled the woods. It was subtle at first, just enough to make me notice, but as the day went on, it became more obvious. By evening, I found another spot to set up camp. It wasn't as good as the first, but I was getting tired and didn't want to push on too far before dark. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and ate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence pressed down on me, thick and unnatural. Every little sound seemed too loud. The snap of a log in the fire, the rustling of my sleeping bag as I shifted. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself. I forced myself to sleep, but it wasn't easy. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. I just lay there, staring up at the fabric of my tent, listening. The fire had died down to embers, barely giving off any light. The air was still cold, and then I heard it. Footsteps, not the rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush, not the wind shaking branches. These were deliberate, slow, careful. They were close, maybe 20 feet from my tent, moving through the trees just beyond the dying glow of my fire. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. I listened as the footsteps stopped. Nothing, just silence. I didn't move. I waited, heart pounding in my chest, straining my ears for any sound. And then a single step, closer. I grabbed the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Maybe, but no animal moved like that. Person? Out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? It didn't make sense. Another step, closer. I couldn't stay in the tent. I knew that. I needed to see what was out there. I moved as slowly as I could, unzipping the tent just an inch, just enough to peek out. The embers of the fire cast a faint glow, but beyond that, nothing but darkness. Then something moved, a shape just at the edge of the firelight, too big to be an animal. It was standing still, just standing there, watching. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, the figure took one step back. Then another, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed in the tent, gripping my knife, listening. But the footsteps didn't come back. The first light, I packed up and started moving. I didn't stop to eat, didn't even fully pack my gear properly. I just wanted to get out of there. I took the shortest route back to my car, moving fast, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The feeling of being watched never left me. By mid-afternoon, I reached my car. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to calm down. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, never found a single trace of who or what had been out there with me. No footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since, and I don't think I ever will. The air was crisp when I stepped out of my truck, the early morning light just starting to seep through the dense forest. It had taken me nearly 3 hours of driving to reach this trailhead, an old, lesser-known path winding deep into the mountains. I had researched it for weeks, looking for something secluded. The online forums described it as remote and challenging, with steep inclines and rugged terrain. Exactly what I wanted. I adjusted my pack, tightening the straps before locking my truck and starting down the trail. The first mile was easy enough, a narrow dirt path lined with thick trees, their skeletal branches reaching out over the trail. It was colder than I expected, the kind of damp cold that seeps through layers of clothing. I exhaled, watching my breath cloud in front of me, and kept walking. The trail quickly turned more difficult. The ground was uneven, covered in rocks and fallen branches. Every few steps, my boots crunched against the frozen earth. I had checked the weather before coming out. No signs of storms, just clear skies and dropping temperatures. It was supposed to get down to the low 20s at night, but I had packed accordingly. After an hour, I paused to take a sip of water. I hadn't seen another person since I left the truck. That was expected. This was one of those trails that people avoided, not because it was dangerous, but because it was out of the way. There were easier, more scenic hikes nearby, the kind with paved paths and benches at the overlooks. This was not one of those. I shouldered my pack and kept moving. The trail began to narrow, winding up the side of the mountain. The incline was steeper than I expected, forcing me to slow down. My legs burned, but I welcomed the feeling. It meant I was getting somewhere. By midday, I had covered several miles and reached a small clearing. The ground leveled out slightly, making it a good place to rest. I set my pack down and pulled out a protein bar, chewing slowly as I took in my surroundings. The trees were dense, their trunks thick with moss. The silence was almost unsettling. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. I didn't rest long. I wanted to cover more ground before nightfall. The next stretch of the trail was rough, steep, winding switchbacks that forced me to use my hands to steady myself on the rocks. I climbed higher, the air growing thinner, my breaths coming heavier. It was exhausting, but the solitude made it worth it. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another boulder jutting from the side of the trail, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A backpack. It was old, torn at the seams, the fabric faded and stiff. Someone had left it here a long time ago. I nudged it with my boot, flipping it over. The straps were frayed, the zipper rusted. I hesitated before crouching down, pulling the flap open. Inside, there was a single shoe, a water bottle, and a crumpled up jacket. No wallet, no ID, nothing that told me who it belonged to. Just abandoned gear left to rot. I stood up, scanning the area. Nothing but trees and rocks. The backpack could have been here for years. Maybe someone had left it behind when it got too heavy. It wasn't unheard of. Still, something about it made my skin crawl. I kept walking. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of steady movement. My legs ached, my breath misting in the cold air. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky a deep orange. I needed to find a place to set up camp. Eventually, I found a relatively flat patch of ground nestled between two large boulders. It was shielded from the wind, at least partially. I dropped my pack and started setting up my tent, my fingers stiff from the cold. Once my shelter was up, I gathered a few fallen branches and lit a small fire. The warmth was immediate, welcome against the growing chill. As I ate, I thought about the backpack again. It was strange, but not unheard of. People abandoned gear all the time. Still, the unease lingered, like something just out of reach. I forced the thought away and focused on my surroundings. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I had expected to hear at least some wildlife, but there was nothing. Just the crackling of my fire and my own breathing. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent. A rustling, a soft crunch of footsteps on frozen ground. But each time I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight out into the darkness, there was nothing. By morning, I felt drained, but I pushed forward anyway. I packed up my gear and continued on the trail, forcing myself to shake off the unease. The path grew steeper, more treacherous. Loose rocks shifted under my feet, sending small cascades of pebbles tumbling down the mountainside. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, determined to reach the summit before midday. Then I saw them.
Footprints.
They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Too fresh. Someone else was up here. I hadn't passed anyone. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. But the tracks were clear, leading further up the trail. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. There was no reason to be afraid. It was probably just another hiker. Maybe someone taking a different route, someone who had started before dawn. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I followed the prints, moving slower now, more cautious. The path narrowed again, hugging the edge of a steep drop. I kept my eyes on the trail, on the tracks leading ahead. Then they stopped, right at the edge of the cliff. No sign of anyone turning back. No scuffs in the dirt. No broken branches leading away. Just nothing. I stood there for a long time, staring at the last print. The wind howled through the trees, biting at my skin. Something was wrong. I turned back. I didn't run, but I moved fast, my heart pounding in my chest. I retraced my steps, my breath coming in short gasps. The sun was dipping lower, the shadows stretching longer. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove, and I never went back. I had always loved hiking alone. The quiet, the steady rhythm of my footsteps on dirt, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. There was nothing like it. That's why, when I found a remote trail deep in the mountains, far from the crowded paths most people stuck to, I didn't hesitate to take it. It was early fall, the air crisp but not too cold, and the leaves had just started to turn. Perfect hiking weather. The trail wasn't marked on any of the maps I had checked, but an older hiker I met at a gas station had mentioned it. If you really want solitude, he had said, there's a path about 10 miles north of the main trailhead. It's not official, but it's well-worn. Leads deep into the woods, past an old logging camp. Hardly anyone goes out that far. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at a small clearing off the highway, loaded my pack with everything I'd need: food, water, a knife, extra socks, and started down the trail. For the first few miles, it was perfect. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sound of birds overhead mixed with the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I felt alive in a way I never did in the city. As I hiked deeper, though, the forest started to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches reaching over the trail like skeletal fingers. The undergrowth thickened, and the trail became less distinct, forcing me to slow down and pick my way carefully. Then I started noticing the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally silent.
No birds.
No wind, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching through leaves and the occasional drip of water from the trees. I stopped to take a drink from my bottle and looked around. The trees seemed darker here, their trunks thick and gnarled. A strange unease settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. I had hiked alone plenty of times. I wasn't going to let a little silence spook me. After another hour of hiking, I found the old logging camp the man had mentioned. At least I thought I did. There were remnants of wooden structures, collapsed under years of rot and weather. Rusted tools lay scattered in the dirt, half buried beneath fallen leaves. I stepped closer to one of the ruins, feeling an odd pull toward it. The wood was blackened, charred, as if there had been a fire. But if there had been, it must have happened decades ago. A sudden, sharp crack split the silence, and I spun around. Nothing. I scanned the trees, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. It could have been a branch breaking under its own weight, but it had sounded deliberate, like a footstep. I waited, my muscles tensed, but there was no other sound. Still, the unease inside me grew. Something about this place felt wrong. I wasn't scared yet, but I was on edge. I decided to keep moving. Staying too long in one place, especially in a location that made me uncomfortable, was never a good idea. As I hiked farther from the logging camp, the trail became even less distinct. I had to stop several times to check my GPS, making sure I was still heading in the right direction. But something was off. No matter how far I walked, my position on the GPS barely seemed to change. I frowned, shaking the device, even though I knew that wouldn't help. I had charged it fully before leaving, and it had always worked fine. Maybe the thick trees were interfering with the signal. I pulled out my compass just to be safe. The needle spun wildly before settling in a direction that didn't seem right. I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of it, but my gut told me I was heading deeper into the forest instead of toward where I had planned to loop back. I needed to turn around. Just as I made that decision, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I turned fast, scanning the trees. Again, nothing, but the feeling that I wasn't alone had settled deep into my bones. I started back the way I had come, walking faster now. The forest felt different, darker, more enclosed. The silence pressed in on me like a physical weight. My breathing sounded too loud, my footsteps too harsh. Then I saw it. A boot print. It was fresh, too fresh, and it wasn't mine. I stopped dead, my pulse hammering. Someone else was out here. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, my eyes darting to every shadow. But whoever had made the print wasn't in sight. I forced myself to move, keeping my pace steady but purposeful. I needed to get back to my truck. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They were slow, deliberate, keeping pace with me but just far enough away that I couldn't see who or what was making them. Panic crawled up my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to run. Running would make noise. Running would tell whoever was out there that I was afraid. I kept walking, forcing myself to stay calm, to think. My knife was in my pack within easy reach. I felt for it, my fingers closing around the handle. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I told myself I was imagining things, that I had spooked myself over nothing. But my gut said otherwise. I walked faster. My truck wasn't far now. Then I saw it. A shape half hidden behind the trees. Person. Watching me. I didn't stop to think. I bolted. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me. But I ran like my life depended on it. Because maybe it did. I could hear movement behind me now, faster, closing in. Whoever they weren't just following me, they were chasing me. My truck came into view, and I dug into my pocket for the keys. My fingers fumbling, I slammed into the driver's side door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, locking it in one motion. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. For one terrible second, The engine didn't turn over. Then it roared to life. I floored it, my tires spinning on the dirt before catching. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who had been out there. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never found out who was in that forest, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing: I won't be hiking alone again. I had been hiking alone for years, and I had never once been afraid of the woods. I grew up in the mountains, spent my childhood exploring trails, and felt at home among the trees. But that day changed everything. I started my hike early in the morning, long before the sun had fully risen. The air was cool and damp from the previous night's rain, and the forest smelled of wet earth and pine. I had chosen a trail that wasn't very popular, one that cut through deep forest and led to a ridge with a spectacular view. It was a longer hike than most, but I wasn't worried. I had my pack loaded with supplies, plenty of water, snacks, a knife, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass. I had my phone, but I knew there wouldn't be service this deep in the woods. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well worn, and though it was narrow, it was clear of debris. I listened to the sounds of the forest, birds calling in the distance, the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Every now and then, I'd hear something larger moving deeper in the trees, likely a deer. About 2 hours in, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, both paths eventually led to the ridge, but the left trail was longer and had a more gradual incline, while the right one was steeper but shorter. I decided to take the right trail. It had rained the night before, so the ground was soft, and I had to be careful with my footing. As I climbed, I noticed how quiet the forest had become. The birds had stopped singing, and even the sound of the wind through the trees seemed muted. I wasn't sure when exactly the change had happened, but it made me uneasy. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the birds had moved to another part of the forest. Maybe the wind had died down, but the silence pressed in on me in a way that made my skin crawl. Then I noticed something else. The trail was disappearing. At first, it was just a few overgrown spots, places where the brush had started to creep in from the sides. But as I kept climbing, the path became harder and harder to follow. Eventually, it was completely gone. I pulled out my map again, checking to make sure I hadn't made a wrong turn, but according to the map, the trail should have still been there. I stood still, trying to decide what to do. I could backtrack and take the longer path, but that would add at least an hour to my hike. Or I could keep going and try to reconnect with the trail ahead. I decided to keep going. I had a compass and I knew the general direction I needed to go. As long as I was careful, I could navigate my way back to the trail. I pushed forward, stepping carefully over fallen branches and loose rocks. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and gnarled, and the further I went, the harder it became to move through them. I started to sweat, not just from exertion, but from the growing unease in my stomach. Then I saw it, a boot print in the mud. It wasn't mine. It was slightly smaller, and the tread was different. My first thought was relief. Someone else had come this way. Maybe the trail wasn't as lost as I thought. But then I noticed something strange. The print was deep, pressed firmly into the damp earth. But the edges were crisp, not softened by rain or time. It was fresh. I scanned the area around me, looking for more signs of another hiker, but I didn't see anything. No footprints leading forward, no sign of movement in the underbrush. Just that one print standing out starkly against the wet ground. I felt my pulse quicken. Someone had been here, but where had they gone? I listened, holding my breath, but the forest was still silent. Too silent. I kept moving, stepping carefully, my ears straining for any sound. The ground was uneven, the slope steeper than I had expected. I had to use my hands to steady myself as I climbed. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A scrap of fabric caught on a low branch. It was dark, maybe black or navy blue, torn as if someone had brushed against it too hard. I reached out and touched it. The edges were frayed, but the material was dry. It hadn't been out in the rain for long. 100 thoughts ran through my mind. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier that morning and had gotten lost just like I had. Maybe they were still nearby. Maybe they needed help. But something about the whole situation felt wrong. I hadn't seen another car at the trailhead. I hadn't passed anyone on the way up. I took a deep breath and kept moving. My legs were burning from the climb, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. The trees were growing denser, their branches reaching low as if trying to close in around me. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, just behind me. I froze. The sound had been quick, almost too quick, like something moving fast through the underbrush. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. But there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I waited, listening, but the sound didn't come again. My heart was racing now. I wasn't alone. I picked up my pace, moving as quickly as I could without losing my footing. The silence pressed in around me again, thick and suffocating. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a branch snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then I reached a small clearing and my blood ran cold. In the center of the clearing was a campsite, but it wasn't like any campsite I'd ever seen. The tent was shredded, the fabric hanging in long, jagged strips. The remains of a fire lay cold in the dirt, half-burned pieces of wood scattered around. And beside the fire, a backpack, partially unzipped, with its contents spilling out. A water bottle, a jacket, a map, and a single muddy boot. I took a step back, my mind racing. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. Or worse, they hadn't left at all. Then, from the trees behind me, I heard it again. The rustling, closer this time. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, barely thinking about where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I didn't stop until I found the trail again. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. I kept running until I reached the parking lot. When I finally got to my car, I locked the doors and sat there, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I looked back at the trailhead, half expecting to see something standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. I never went back to that trail. I never reported what I found. And to this day, I don't know what was out there in the woods with me. But I do know one thing: I will never hike alone again. The trail wasn't supposed to be difficult. I had checked the maps, read the reviews, and even asked a few people online who had hiked it before. It was listed as moderate, about 9 miles round trip, with a steady incline but nothing too extreme. I packed light, water, a few protein bars, my pocket knife, and a flashlight just in case. It was mid-autumn, and the temperature was perfect. Cool enough to keep me from sweating too much, but warm enough that I didn't need layers. The plan was simple: get to the summit by early afternoon, eat a snack, take some photos, then head back before sunset. I had done plenty of solo hikes before. I wasn't worried. The first few miles were exactly as I expected. The trail was well maintained, lined with fallen leaves and the occasional exposed root. Tall trees flanked both sides, their orange and yellow leaves swaying gently in the wind. The crunching sound under my boots was the only noise besides the distant calls of birds. Felt peaceful, alone but not lonely. As I climbed higher, the trail narrowed. The trees thinned out a little, exposing more of the rolling hills in the distance. The wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead. I was making good time. About 4 miles in, I stopped for a drink, leaning against a large boulder. Everything was still normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed something that made me pause. There was another trail, one that wasn't on the map. It was faint, barely more than a worn strip of dirt snaking off into the trees. At first, I figured it was just a game trail, maybe used by deer or other animals. But there were boot prints. They were old, maybe a few days at most, but definitely human. They trailed off into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I hesitated for a second, considering whether I should check it out. My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped onto the narrow path, my boots sinking slightly into the softer earth. It wasn't well traveled, and branches hung low, forcing me to duck. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The wind didn't reach here. The birds had gone silent. Even my footsteps felt muffled. I walked for maybe 10 minutes before I saw something ahead. A small clearing. In the center stood a wooden structure, old and weathered, no bigger than a shed. It had a slanted roof, its planks gray with age. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I took a few careful steps closer, scanning the area. No signs of recent activity. No fresh footprints. No tire tracks. I tried the door, expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of damp wood. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves. There were old, rusted tools on a shelf. An axe with a splintered handle, a handsaw with teeth dulled by time. In the corner, a wooden crate sat half open, filled with more tools. And then I saw the sleeping bag. It was pushed up against the far wall, wrinkled and covered in dust. Next to it, empty cans of food, plastic water bottle partially crushed. Whoever had been here wasn't here now, but they had been recently enough that the bottle hadn't completely flattened. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something about it felt wrong. I turned to leave when I noticed something else. Carvings on the inside of the door. At first, they just looked like random scratches, but when I looked closer, I saw they were words. Don't follow it. My stomach tightened. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to find out. I backed out of the shed, my pulse picking up. I told myself it was nothing, just some old structure someone had used for shelter. The words? Probably just a joke, or maybe someone trying to scare off trespassers. But as I made my way back to the main trail, something felt different. The air was heavier, like the forest itself was watching me. The silence was deeper, almost unnatural. And then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze, listening. It was faint, but it was their slow, deliberate steps somewhere behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the same stretch of woods, empty and still. I told myself it was my imagination. The wind, a falling branch, anything but what my mind was suggesting. I picked up my pace. The footsteps did too. I didn't run. Running would mean panic. Panic would mean mistakes. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, even though every part of me screamed to sprint. The sound never got closer, but it didn't fade either. It stayed with me, just out of sight. I reached the main trail and didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked faster than I ever had before, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I just needed to get back to my car. Mile after mile, the feeling of being watched never left. I tried to rationalize it, but deep down, I knew something had changed the moment I stepped off the main trail. I had ignored something I shouldn't have. When I finally saw my car through the trees, relief flooded me. I practically jogged the last stretch, unlocking the doors the second I got close. I threw my pack in, got in the driver's seat, and locked the doors. Then I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my breathing. I glanced back at the trailhead. Nothing, just trees and fading sunlight. I started the engine and drove away, watching the forest shrink in my rearview mirror. I don't know what I heard. I don't know what was following me, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back.